from the so-called peace dividend to a situation that is actually worse insofar as liberty is concerned than it was during the entire Cold War. And equally important, how do we get out of this mess? 9/11. Immediately after the 9/11 attacks, President Bush made a dramatic and important announcement. That announcement related to motivation. The motivation of those who had committed the attacks. The President told the country that what motivated these terrorists was their hatred for America's freedom and values. It was an interpretation of motivation to which all Americans were immediately expected to subscribe. Immediately, the mantra was picked up by people in the State Department, the Pentagon, those in the neocon community, the conservative element, the liberal element, even some libertarians picked up the mantra. The reason why it was so important for the President to do that, and so quickly, was that the last thing U.S. officials wanted was for the American people to take a close, critical look at U.S. foreign policy, and specifically what U.S. officials had been doing since the fall of that Berlin Wall. Not only in the Middle East, but also in places like Latin America, where the Pentagon, in desperate search of a mission after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and desperately trying to convince the Americans why they did not need this peace dividend, why they should keep this military-industrial complex continuing and ongoing, had ratcheted up the war on drugs in Latin America, supporting brutal regimes. And of course, we're seeing the fruits of that now in terms of increased drug war terrorist attacks on our southern border, which are almost certain to spill over at some point or another onto our side of the border. In the Middle East, for example, there were the cruel and brutal sanctions against the Iraqi people. Now, it's difficult to arrive at an extremely accurate estimate of the number of Iraqi children that were killed by these sanctions. The best estimates are 300,000, 400,000. Madeleine Albright, who was a high U.S. official, she had the authority to speak on behalf of the U.S. government, to announce the principles and policies of the U.S. government. She was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. She was asked by 60 Minutes whether the deaths of 500,000 Iraqi children had been worth it. And she answered, well, it's a hard issue, but yes, those deaths are worth it. It was a statement that Americans were by and large indifferent to, given the predisposition of the American people to leave foreign policy to the experts in Washington, much as they leave the operation of the economy to those experts in Washington. But I guarantee you it was a statement that reverberated throughout the Middle East. What in the world could justify the deaths of hundreds of thousands, of 500,000 children, Iraqi or any other nationality? Well, to understand that, it's necessary to put those sanctions into context, how they came into existence, what their purpose was, why U.S. officials considered them so important. For that, we go back to 1991 during the Persian Gulf intervention, an intervention in which U.S. officials had turned on their former partner and ally, Saddam Hussein, a person that they had supported during the 1980s. In the midst of that conflict, the Pentagon did a secret study. trying to determine what would happen if they knowingly and intentionally dropped bombs and destroyed the water and sewage facilities in Iraq. And they concluded the same thing that U.S. officials would later conclude with respect to Hurricane Katrina. You'll recall that U.S. officials were telling people, don't drink the water after Hurricane Katrina because you can get sick and you can even die. That's the same thing that Pentagon officials concluded about bombing these water and sewage facilities in Iraq. Whereupon, having reached that conclusion, they proceeded to order the destruction of those water and sewage facilities through the bombing of them. At the termination of the conflict, they continued enforcing the most brutal regime of sanctions that one can ever imagine. It's not like this brutal embargo that they've had against Cuba for some 45 years, which is really a control on the American people. They put Americans in jail who travel and trade with the Cuban people. But the Cubans at least could continue trading with people in Europe, Asia, and so forth. Here we had a virtually total embargo. No sale of oil by the Iraqi government, and the boarding of every ship and the rejection of every ship that contained any type of equipment that could repair these water and sewage facilities. And their prediction turned out to be right. Infectious illnesses, diseases, especially among the young, the newborn, the toddlers, the children. And throughout this time, week after week, month after month, because these sanctions lasted 11 years, and year after year, as these children were dying, there was a cauldron of anger that was starting to boil in the Middle East, not only among the parents who were losing their children, but among their countrymen, their friends, their neighbors, their relatives, fellow Muslims, fellow Arabs, who knew that there was no way to break the stranglehold of these sanctions. There was a sense of helplessness and desperation and anger that was boiling. Two high UN officials, Hans von Sponeck and Dennis Halliday, resigned their positions in protest to what they call this genocide. They said, we cannot participate in this any longer. And they resigned. To add to the anger, U.S. officials threw in a bit of humiliation by stationing a large contingent of U.S. forces on the holiest lands in the Muslim religion, Mecca and Medina. To add to the helplessness and the desperation to that sense of those things, U.S. officials established the no-fly zones over Iraq. No consent of Congress, no consent of the United Nations. The president simply unilaterally set up those no-fly zones, which provided them the excuse to continue firing missiles and dropping bombs on the Iraqi people. I'll never forget reading an article about a 13-year-old boy during this period of time of the no-fly zones that was tending his sheep, and he had his head blown totally off his body by one of those smart missiles that turned out to be not too smart. Here was the anger boiling, 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 until it finally erupted. U.S. officials said, they struck us because they hate our freedom and values. We're shocked. We're surprised. We had no idea. But you see, some of us did have an idea of what was coming. If you look at articles that we were publishing on our website at the Future of Freedom Foundation, they're online, 1999, 2000, especially those by Sheldon Richman. We were saying that if you don't stop these policies, you're going to see terrorist attacks on American soil. What Chalmers Johnson calls blowback, what the CIA called blowback. In fact, Chalmers Johnson was saying the same thing. He is the man that's written this tremendous trilogy of books on foreign policy: Blowback, The Sorrows of Empire, and Nemesis. In his book, Blowback, published before 9/11, he was saying, if you don't stop these policies, you're going to suffer the blowback, because that's what's going to motivate them.